Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. It's called Legal Tech Readiness, a guide for legal departments. Today's webinar will be all about legal tech, and our goal here is to help you feel confident in your legal tech search, journey, and implementations, if you get to that stage. Our moderator today is Lily Shura, founder and chief strategist at Lolly Legal, which is a legal ops and tech consulting boutique firm. Before we begin, a few quick comments. So first of all, the webinar is being recorded and on-demand access will be available for our members within their member library. This session is also eligible for one professionalism hour in Ontario and one CPD hour in BC, and reporting instructions will be sent to you by email after the event. Please keep in mind that the speakers cannot see you and have no way of reading the room. So if you can, please participate as much as possible by using emojis and writing in the chat box. A note about the chat box is to please ensure that it's set to everyone and not just hosts and panelists, so that we all see your comments. And then with that said, I'm going to hand it off to you, Lily, and
Awesome.
take it from here.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So just give me a thumbs up, guys, if you can see the screen with the presentation. Yeah? Okay. Obviously, I can only see the panelists, so thank you. So first, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves, everyone who's here. Like Avi said, I run Lolly Legal Consulting. I help in-house teams operate with the efficiency of large teams by focusing on legal ops strategies. I also work with legal tech companies to help them better serve people like you. So super excited to be here. We've got a great panel. Lara, I'm going to pass it to you. Can you introduce yourself and talk about your superpower?
Sure. I'm Lara Trope and I work with the InnoLaw Group. So we work with in-house teams primarily to help them optimize the way they do contracting. We do legal ops consulting generally, but my superpower is in the CLM space, the people, the process, and so much technology. That's me.
That's awesome. Kyle, what about you?
Hey, everybody. I'm Kyle Barr in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the founder of Sea Change Legal Ops, LLC, which is a full-service legal operations and technology consultancy. I'm a 20-year legal professional, 15-year lawyer. Looking forward to speaking with you all today.
And Foster, over to you.
Thanks, Lily. Hey, everyone. I'm Foster Sayers. I'm Vice President of Legal Operations at Simpler, where I am transforming the delivery of legal services in our organization, which is a conglomerate of health IT companies that's private equity backed. And my superpower is transforming legal operations through efficient processes and effective use of technology.
I'm really excited to have you guys here. Let's go ahead and talk about what's in store for today for everyone. So I've got a number of slides here that just have questions for our panelists. Got just a wealth of expertise here from our group. So I just want to make sure we have a chance to talk about their expertise, talk about some of the things that you guys will be facing in-house when either looking at existing technology that you have and can maybe leverage better, new technology that you may want to bring into your organization, things like that. And when it's time to look at new technology, how do you select that tech? How do you manage the change management aspects of it? Get people ready for the big changes that come from using new technology. And then at the end, we'll save that time for questions from you guys. But if you have questions in the meantime, you can feel free to put them in the chat box here. So let's get started. We're going to start with talking about, and forgive me while I look to the side, that's where my slide deck is, guys. But we're going to start by talking about existing tech. So maybe you look at your in-house team, you say, that you want to be more efficient, you want more data, but you're not exactly sure how to get it. So let's see if your existing tools can help. So question for the panelists, does legal operations change always have to come from dedicated legal tech? Or do you, in your experience, think that you can use existing tools that your organization may have to get the same kind of benefit?
Yeah, maybe I'll hop in here. So I was in-house counsel for 5.5 years at a Fortune 200 company called Wesco Distribution, which is based here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I handled legal operations for our legal department. And one of the things that I really focused on was optimizing our current tech stack, which we were a Microsoft 365 shop. And think about what lawyers do and legal professionals do and what technology they're always using. It's Outlook and Word, right? So we can optimize those even though they're not quote unquote legal tech, we can always try to figure out how to optimize those. And then if you are in a Microsoft land, or if you're in, the G Suite or someplace else, think about the other tools that are surrounding those main, word processing and communication tools, and try to think how they might best interact to optimize your experience using what you already have.
I think I'm just going to jump on the back of what Kyle said. I agree, but also it depends who you're trying to support and the change that you're managing. Sales, procurement, it's not always legal at the center, maybe trying to direct work to legal, but meeting people where they work is at the core of what we have realized is the start of making that decision on whether to really optimize what they have, where they're used to working, and whether or not they can actually consume more than that. Sometimes there is better tech for the job, but depending on the size and context of your organization, the change management may just be impractical and improbable to actually do. So on paper, there are requirements. We want everything. Even if we manage to prioritize those down to some core nuggets, there's still that aspect of how many people are working in a certain way, and is it realistic to try and expect them to change? So that's also a heavy factor in optimizing what you have or going shopping for more.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And when you're looking at that question of whether existing tech is going to be what you use for whatever purpose you have, for whatever reason that may be, to Lara's point, how do you know if existing tech will actually serve your team's needs? Like, how do you assess that as a team or as an organization?
I'll lead on this one. So one of the things that you may find is that there are tools relative to, say, some like intake of a matter or intake of a contract, where it's leveraged by other members of the business who maybe own part of that function. So classic example, leveraging the case object in Salesforce. Well, it wasn't designed for legal, right? But it was designed to help track and manage service to, a sales organization. So is it going to be enough to serve your team needs? It really depends. It depends on a lot of the resources available. So simply by virtue of having an existing tech and it being capable of doing something doesn't necessarily mean that it will serve your team's needs, because you have to, in fact, confirm that the resources that would be required to actually configure it to meet your team's needs are going to be available to you, and make sure you understand that before committing down a path where you're going to leverage existing tech.
I think that makes complete sense. And Foster, I'm going to pick on you a little bit more here to answer this next question. When you're thinking about what tech to use, whether it's existing tech or new tech, I know you in particular have a lot of experience looking at existing projects, existing strategic initiatives, and making sure that your tech strategy aligns with your business strategy. So talk us through some of those kinds of thoughts in making that kind of decision.
Sure. One of the things that may not be familiar to folks who are in the legal field or contracts professionals who are just now exploring leveraging legal technology is that there's an organization somewhere in your business. Likely it may be simply your IT department. In larger, more sophisticated companies, it may be called enterprise apps or business operations. But whatever team is leading the strategy overall for your organizational operations and the systems that are used to run those, you need to understand that. You need to become friends with that person and understand what are they working on, what is their vision, and what are they going in the direction, and what direction are they going in? Because when you can align with that, then you can have access potentially to budget that you may not have yet procured for your project, because by aligning with what they're doing on their implementation, you can influence it in a direction that's going to help solve for where you're solving. And so understanding what is their strategy, but also are there existing projects that are funded where it would make sense to bring in something around legal tech. So let me give you an example. One of the things that I needed to do at my business was to automate some of the contracts. And a lot of people will think, oh, NDAs, that's always where you start with automation. Well, not so fast. When you want investment from the business, you really want to understand what is something that the business cares about and is focused on solving. At my business, it was affirmative renewals. Our customers typically don't agree to auto-renewing contracts, which means you have to actually deliberately renew them through a subsequent agreement. And legal was manually generating those. And this was becoming a pain point for the folks on the renewals team who were trying to consummate the renewal and get it booked. So that was something that, an understanding that the company was focused on investing in ways to improve our renewals process, it was very easy for me to get approval for my project to then go forward with a new contract workflow that would result in the automation. So think about that, and then, using that example or others, figure out how does what I want to do align with that? Because when you do that, you ensure you're going to have the highest probability of success, both from getting approval, but also ensuring adoption. Because if your tool doesn't play nicely with the others that are strategically of focus, then it may be the case that your technology doesn't get adopted, and then it wouldn't be a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I'll stay on this slide for just a second because Kyle, I want to bring it back to you for a moment. Foster said something about becoming, best friends with someone on the IT team or the app strategy team or something along those lines when you're thinking about your kind of project. And I know in your experience with Microsoft Suite, there is also that limitation of how much you can do heading up legal ops versus how much you need the support of another team like IT, et cetera, right? To be able to build out what you want in your existing tool that you're leveraging, like a SharePoint, for example. Can you speak to that a little bit before we move on?
Yeah, most certainly. So your IT team, when it comes to Microsoft or probably G Suite as well, they have a relationship with the folks at that vendor. Giant company, but they're still a vendor. They're still a supplier to your company. So make friends with the IT person who has that relationship, and also ask for a meeting with the folks at Microsoft or Google who support your company, because they will roll out all sorts of great resources for you as you're exploring this journey of trying to implement their tools even better within your department.
Absolutely. Let's keep talking about existing tech for a bit. So this next slide is on seeing and leveraging what you have. So we talked about how big changes don't always have to come from dedicated tech. You can use existing tools. So Kyle, I'm going to pick on you a little bit, and Lara, I know you've got SharePoint experience too, so I'd love your thoughts here. How can you use non-dedicated tech like SharePoint, for example, for legal purposes? Foster spoke about using Salesforce. Let's talk a little bit about something like SharePoint.
Yeah, exactly. SharePoint was a tool that I leveraged within my team to get us all on the same page. We were working off of a network drive when I joined the company within the legal department, and that became very clunky when we had to do VPN hookups when the pandemic hit and we were all working remote. So I started exploring our abilities with SharePoint for our contract archive. I was on the dispute side, so getting all of our disputes documents in one spot on SharePoint where the entire team could go access them. Of course, SharePoint has security measures as well within your organization. So one thing that legal professionals are always worried about is confidentiality, not only just externally, but also within the organization itself. And with Microsoft's security, you can very well dictate who can see your documents that are on SharePoint. So we found it to be a very good solution while we were thinking about other more dedicated knowledge management or contract records management solutions.
Lara, do you have any additional thoughts to add to that, or any examples of ways that you can improve legal operations without spending money on a new tool?
So I think, as you say, for us, the way we operate, or I operate, is always, like I said, getting that view of all the legal tech you have in your tech stack. And then it becomes a game of integrations. Integrations between things you can layer and leverage between each other. Obviously, individual tools can be optimized in certain ways. They're usually set up for the team that chose them. So Salesforce is only going to take you so far. Ariba, NetSuite, whatever. There's only so much you can get out of that legal can leverage. But there are ways, as you say, to use other tools, like integrate between systems that you have, that may even ServiceNow ticketing system. We've seen legal leverage things like that, which tech uses as well, the IT team uses as well. So there are various ways to optimize aspects of the tech stack to get out data reporting insights that can be useful for the legal team to get data moving and flowing between things. There are plugins and systems you may not have lit up, like Word integrations, Outlook integrations, and things like that. Plugins that can bring systems together to make them useful for the teams that need them. So the only thing I would add that there's absolutely ways to fine tune the legal tech you have, or non-legal tech that has features that may be leveraged better. But depending on your priority requirements, it's all about fine-tuning, extracting the data, the reporting, getting it flowing the way you want it to. And if in an ideal world, getting some of those systems integrated so that various teams can be brought together. Because I will say that, again, depends on the size of the team, the context that they work in. It's very unlikely you're going to get all stakeholders working in the same system in large organizations. So I think what Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking more of like a legal focus, what the legal team needs. The universe I come from is almost exclusively focused on helping legal serve that business better and trying to pull the systems together where they work and getting things flowing to legal and back to them in an integrated way. So there are layers of things you can add on without buying big flashy tools to make that work. But the integration game is a complicated and fun one. And anyone who's lived through custom integrations knows this to be true.
I love the reference to the integration game, and something you said really stuck with me. And I actually want to ask Foster about his experience with this. So Lara mentioned leveraging some of the integration capabilities, right? Because I think everybody can look at their existing tech stack and see a lot of tools, and it's not always going to be best practice to integrate with everything. So what are your thoughts on how you make sure that whatever tools you're using, existing or new, that you're being mindful that the way that data is flowing is working for both the legal department and the organization that it serves?
I think anytime you're doing integrations, you want to be very outcome focused and make sure that, in fact, that integration is necessary to get to the outcome that you're trying to get to. Where I think people can kind of over-index to integrations is where the data conversation makes them kind of feel almost like compulsively driven to have access and connections to kind of all relevant data. But I think that's something you need to really be honest about relative to how meaningful is this information in this system or that system before we commit to making an integration. And also think about, what does it look like for me to have what I call, or what they call in the lean agile development methodology, a minimal viable product. I may want to integrate with 10 things, but really I only need to integrate with 2 to get to the outcome that I'm seeking today. And if I'm successful with getting the first 2, well, I can build on that success and I can get to those others in the future. So I think when you're doing that, you want to be cognizant of the fact that more integrations, more things that you have to solve for, more things that can go wrong in your project, and that the fewer that you have, the more focus you have, and the more you maximize your chances of success.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. So just before we move on from this slide, I have a question about pros and cons of using existing tech. I think we've talked about a number of those things, but I want to go back to something Lara mentioned in her superpower, right? People, process, technology. So how do you keep those 3 things in mind when deciding whether to use existing tech and whether the actual plan for existing tech is going to benefit your team?
I mean, happy to take that one just because
Go for it.
The day-to-day. We all know that tech is only a booster to good foundations, good people doing the right things with good processes. This is hopefully not news to everybody on this call, but having that done well and executed well is harder than anyone gives it credit for, and maintaining all of that. So, foundations before automation is absolutely key. I think that the first step in any legal tech project, before you even get to the conversation that we're having, optimize, select, new, implement, you really have to take a long, hard look at, do I understand the current state of how I'm operating? Who is doing what? Are they doing it in the best way? And how can I fill those operational gaps? Because automating a bad process will just give you a speedier or slightly broken automated process. But adding automation to a well-oiled process with the right people and resources in place will work almost surely. And most tools do what they say they can do. And with the right stuff going in and the right foundations, they'll serve you well. So, yep, always foundation before automation, people and process.
Gentlemen, anything you want to add to that before we move on?
I agree. People before process, most definitely. Cons to using existing tech to improve your legal team is that the existing tech isn't built for legal teams. So it might be important. You might find that existing tech just doesn't suit the needs of your team. A pro of using existing tech is that it's usually a familiar interface to your legal team. Folks typically don't want to change. Folks are resistant to change. And so if you can keep things as familiar as possible when trying to implement new things, such as the user interface that they might already be used to, that's something that might help with leading to success.
Yeah. One con, just to add, when you're looking at the existing tech, you need to be mindful of the fact that, so for example, Salesforce, if others are using that technology, then that means that the resources that, say, work on the tickets to enhance it, to work for your purposes, they have tickets from all those departments too. So just be mindful that it may be like, oh, this solves for adoption because we've already adopted this tool and we don't need to go through budget because this is something we already spend money on and we already have a team that knows how to make changes. Yes, those are all positives. Those are all pros, but think through what that resourcing looks like and talk to other departments and see when the last time they had a ticket worked on before committing to that direction.
I think that's a great point. In my own experience, I had the team that built tickets for an internal system we were trying to use tell me that they couldn't support me for 9 months, right? So that's really scary to face that when you need the support quickly. But of course, understanding they're busy because it's a tool that, like you said, other teams are using. I just want to touch on, Kathleen made a great comment in the chat about integrations requiring some data scrubbing to make sure that the data is actually the same, named the same thing in the different places, for example, Oracle and wherever else you're going to be putting your data, like a CLM. That's true whether you're using existing tech or new tech. So definitely something to keep in mind, especially when you're thinking, like Foster said, about that outcome focused approach to whatever you're using. So if you're going to try to do 10 integrations and everything requires a data scrubbing effort, yet another reason that may not be a good use of your time. So let's move on. Still talking about current and existing tech. We're going to start to move off of this though. The question is really, how do you know when your existing tech isn't serving your team's needs and when you need to turn to new technology? Kyle, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. When existing tech isn't serving the needs, when you're finding out from your team, Foster made a good point earlier about communication. This is so much of this, and Laura's point about people. So much of this is about communication and meeting with your team, meeting cross-functionally with other functions. And so get feedback from your team. Find out what things are working and what things aren't. And once you start hearing that critical things aren't working right, then it's time to start looking for new alternatives.
Foster, Lara, anything you guys want to add to that?
I think it's well said. Again, I'm a big proponent of checking in constantly on or periodically on the current state, sense checking that things are going the way they're going. Name of the game here is efficiency. And if things are going well, you should also have data and insights to support some of the things that you hope are going the way that you do. But you will hear pretty quickly where your insights show that things are going into a black hole and never coming out, or that the user adoption is also very telling. So you may have systems where things are just sitting, they've become stale or dormant, and users are just reverted back to other things and have decided that Teams is the way to negate the entire big system that you have in place. It's probably time to look at what you're doing and change course there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk about changing course, right? Let's talk about understanding your use case for new tech. So you've decided you need to find new technology for your team. Let's really talk about how you get started. So how can a legal team best understand what technology will serve their unique needs and really what their unique needs are when they're thinking about the technology that they want to consider? Foster, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. One of the things that legal teams need to start out with is their requirements, and they need to be laser focused on what those requirements are. And they need to remember something, which is that, you know, Lara, Kyle, these people are experts, but remember, you are the expert on you. You're the expert on your business and your department and what you need and what you're trying to solve. And sometimes when talking with experts, maybe not these experts, but others, they may start to oversell you. They may start to introduce features or show you functionality that wasn't in your requirements, but hey, that looks really nifty. Here's the thing. Avoid scope creep on the front end when you're first engaging in this process to find your legal tech, because when you're laser focused and true to your own requirements, you're best going to find your match in the market. But if you let yourself be led around, then you may be led to something that isn't the best match for you.
Yeah, we always
And it's
say,
totally, oh,
sorry.
sorry. Go ahead. I was going to say it's totally fine to tell a vendor no thanks about something. They're salespeople, right? They're trying to sell a product to you. So we all can do well by, if we don't need something sold to us, just saying no, and the salespeople will understand and they'll move on to what you need.
Yeah, and we always use the analogy that, you know, you take someone to the buffet and they're going to want it all and they're going to want the dessert, but really, where is the salad and the broccoli that you actually need? So you have to keep sense checking and use those requirements that Foster mentioned, prioritized requirements as your North Star. And as you're collecting feedback from stakeholders, acknowledge and rank it in that mindset, because otherwise you can be led every which way. And also every system does have its limitations and its superpowers. Not everybody can do everything. So I feel like the moment you're being told yes to everything, you might want to take a little step back there and be like, okay, this is way too salesy. And I'm going to have to, you know, call on a friend and expert, somebody who uses the system to give me the real inside scoop on what's going on here. Which is a lot of, like I said, the work that we do is helping people navigate that because of that very problem. It's very hard and overwhelming to consume that much coming at you and still, you know, keep your eye on that North Star and make decisions, which also goes into a topic we won't go into in depth now, which is running demos properly, pilots, proof of concept. Those things all have merit. Foster smiling. He's done this, he's been in this rodeo a few times. So it's a fun, but it's definitely something worthwhile thinking about as you move through that process before you commit.
Yeah, we will absolutely talk a little bit more about avoiding demo fatigue and how to manage setting up demos and things like that. But before you even get to the demo stage, if you're reaching out to vendors saying, hey, I want to talk to you, I want to learn more about your product, you've done the work to understand what your requirements are. How do you best communicate those requirements to the vendors so that you know that you're going to go into a conversation that is focused, hopefully, on those requirements, that they've listened to you and can communicate how their tech can support or not support those?
I mean, like I said, good legal operations housekeeping here. We document some more, we communicate well, and we try to keep things crisp and comparable in the best way that we can. I feel like, you know, it's just a lot of this is not so much rocket science as it is good communication, good housekeeping, good project management, keeping your eye on the prize, and, you know, just making sure that you keep what's important at the center of what you're trying to achieve in a manageable and consumable way that you can communicate well. And I think that's true of many projects, not just legal tech, but it does certainly help. But yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. We'll talk more about communication and demos as we move on here, but let's talk a little bit more about working internally and whether it's with your legal team or your business team. You understand that you need new tech. You've decided you're going to start going after it. You've looked at your requirements. How do you convince other people that it's time for new tech? So how can you get other team members on the legal team on board with the idea of even considering a new technology?
We're ready for you to discuss, Lily.
Well, I'm sorry.
I said, pick a person to answer. I feel like we all have so much to say.
Fair. Sorry, guys.
I think
know.
Foster. I think
yeah,
Foster was
I'm gonna start with you.
Sure. And I was just, inclined to speak because this is stuff that I'm working through right now with my team and some new legal tech projects. And when I am going through the phase of what I call adoption and getting people to kind of adopt either my point of view or my point of view on track to adopt new legal technology, I try to break it into kind of three components and think through. There's the mental adoption, which is, do they understand? Does it make sense to them? There's the emotional adoption, which is, are they comfortable or are they afraid and they're going to go right back to a workaround? And then there's the practical adoption, like, do they actually know how to do the thing with the thing? And so when I'm first starting out, I focus on the mental adoption and making sure that when I socialize it with other team members, that fundamentally it makes sense. They understand why the way will be, preferable, more efficient, easier for them, so that when it comes to the emotional adoption, that's a lot less scary. And it's going to be a lot easier to get them on board and feel comfortable about changing the way that they're working, so that when we finally come down to now we're ready to go live with training and we do that practical the practical component, that my hope is then by checking all those boxes, we'll successfully adopt the new technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you broke that down. Yeah, please, Kyle, go ahead.
I'll pop in and say that going right off of what Foster was saying, find the champion within the team who really wants this to happen. It's going back to something that we said earlier. Maybe it's that person who said there's a problem and it needs to be fixed. They're going to be your champion because they're the one who's really behind this. It might be your GC or your chief legal officer. But have that person be on your side and help you communicate the message for change, so that it's not only coming from you, it's coming from others on the team.
Yeah. And I will say, agree completely, but we've seen it done differently depending on the organization. Sometimes carrots, sometimes sticks. Sometimes something is we want everybody to be on board. We want everything to be positive. We want everyone to come along with us and be part of the journey. But sometimes things are so irrevocably broken that you can no longer hold that course. So we do our best to make it as positive as we can, but occasionally you need to bring in a hammer from the C-suite to say, the clock is ticking, we want you all on board, and everybody will come around. So we've seen it done different ways depending on the culture, the organization, and also what's come before.
Yeah, I think, Lara, to your point, it goes a long way if you can communicate that. If you have to use the stick method, if you can communicate that early on in the adoption phase, as opposed to, I literally had someone send me a scary screenshot of an email that they received in their organization that said, we've implemented a new CLM, get on board or else, essentially, which is a big, no one knew that they were doing it. There was a team kind of handling it internally, not telling anyone. And then all of a sudden the change is happening. You have to, buy in right now. So I think if you can do that early enough that people can ask their questions and they can get more comfortable on the emotional side, like Foster was saying, that certainly has a big impact. So let's talk a little bit more. Lara, you mentioned that your expertise at InnoLaw focuses a lot on supporting the organization, the legal team supporting the organization. So we talked about getting legal team members on board. We talked a little bit about kind of communicating with the business, but do you have any other thoughts on how to share with the business team that this consideration of new tech is happening, and the kinds of things to get their feedback on, things like that?
I think we've tread this ground a little bit already. I think, which is communicating early and well about things so people don't feel blindsided, making sure as part of your requirements gathering, you also want to keep your eye on that cross-section of stakeholders. I think Kyle mentioned much earlier on. You want to make sure that the right people are informed. I mean, the way I approach these things is, you create your groups and then you kind of create a communication plan per group. You have certain communications, all communications will go to a core group, your champions, your the people who are fundamentally leading the project. And then there's reports to the executive team who want to stay informed. And then there are the ultimate users who you want to bring in at the right time when you have the right answers. So there is a bit of part art, part science to getting change management right. But I do think that just being very clear that you have got the right groups on your radar and that communicating the right amount of information at the right times. And when in doubt, I would prefer more communication than less. I think that's always helpful. As you say that, hey, we implemented new CLM, we're just going to delete the current repository doesn't usually go over super well.
Absolutely.
Lara said the right time, making that communication at the right time. And one important consideration for the right time is your company's business cycle. So understanding when budgeting requests should be done, like annual budgeting, understanding also just like what's going on at that moment within the company. If times are tight, then it's probably not the best time maybe to suggest legal tech implementation when, or, make that budget ask for legal tech implementation when maybe a few months down the road when this rough patch passes, it might be a more optimal time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when it comes to budgeting, you can do a lot of the same things that Foster was saying about that kind of mental and emotional piece, the benefits to your team, the benefits to the leadership team, like why it matters to the business to do something like this. I'm going to just keep us moving because we're coming up on time here. So instead of setting budget, I think we're going to move straight into exploring tech options. So it's time to look into what tech tools are out there. You've set the requirements, you've got the buy-in, you've got the budget, or at least some sense of budget. How do you find the right tools to consider for your new legal tech needs? Like we'll use CLM as the example. If you research CLM, you can come up on 200 plus vendors, right? How do you say, these are the ones I want to talk to? Lara, over to you.
I guess it's difficult because, there is so much out there. So speaking to people who have been on this journey, people who are in the industry is helpful because it's a lot to sift through on your own, especially when you have a full-time job. But like, as you said, if you've set the stage correctly and you have a clear idea of what is important to you, you pick a handful of vendors who say they can do what they do, and then you set up that demo. I don't advise people going to 10, 12, 20 demos. You actually can no longer sensibly compare those in any way. So I think you get a sense from an initial call that's hopefully well structured based on the requirements you're able to send to vendors saying, these are our priorities, I want to see these things. You have those initial calls, you get your short list, and then you can go into more structured, deeper demos with a short list of vendors that at least on the surface tick your boxes. And there are other things that you're able to get from people that you speak to as well about customer support. Like they technically do these things, but do they support enterprises? Are they best suited small and mid-market teams? So there are a couple of other factors swirling around that are hard to get from the vendor themselves. But that hybrid approach of being able to communicate to the vendor your priorities, setting up the demos in the right way, those initial calls and potentially second demos, and then also reaching out to people in the industry to say, hey, you use this tool, what do you think? Or, people who've just tread this ground before you, so you save yourself some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to make a quick plug because I've used this personally to help me and some of my clients. InnoLaw came out with a CLM market study on CLMs in particular to outline which ones can cover which things, right? Which ones do the things they say they do and what things they actually say they do. Can be enormously helpful in just comparing the lists of, hundreds of vendors. Foster, thinking about talking to friends, peers, industry leaders about various technology needs, you said you are the expert in you and your needs, your requirements. You're absolutely right. I mean, how do you keep a delicate balance between what worked for someone and what may work for you based on your requirements?
If you start with my recommendation of getting laser focused on your requirements at the beginning, then you will have an anchor to evaluate your peers' recommendations, right? You can say, I'm going to weigh their advice against what matters to me, instead of falling into the same trap that folks fall into with vendors that start talking about flashy features. If I'm talking about something, flashy and fancy that I've done with a vendor in my implementation, and that's not in your requirements, then don't weigh that too heavily when you're evaluating my recommendation. But I would say that you do not want to get going in this world if you've not talked with an actual user or someone who is very familiar with that particular vendor.
I think that's great advice, because it gives you such a clearer view of what is actually happening outside of the sales conversations you're having. I'm just going to keep us moving here. So let's talk about scheduling the right demos. We've talked about identifying key criteria to focus on just by virtue of the requirements gathering you've done. Kyle, I'm going to turn this to you. Lara mentioned don't do 10 to 20 demos. Totally agree with that. Demo fatigue is real. You lose sight of what you're looking at. How do you know how many demos that you should schedule, and how do you know how much time to dedicate them, and who should attend? Just talk us through your thoughts when looking at setting up demos for new technology.
Yeah, it in part depends on the tech that you're looking at, how many vendors are out there. Certainly demo fatigue is a thing, and typically demos can be anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour in my experience. So, if you have 10 demos scheduled, that could be 10 hours of your time and other folks' time as well. So you want to make sure that you're not overdoing it. In part with all the research that you've done, like Foster and Laura have talked about, the research that you've done, being laser focused on what you need. Hopefully that helps you sort out who you're actually interested in. And then you can go along and get your 3 to 5 demos, depending on what tech solution you're looking at. And also who should attend these demos. It's not just going to be one person. It's not just going to be you. It should most likely be at least another person from the legal department who is part of the user group for that solution, so that you can get input off of the demo of what it looked like to someone who's going to be using the tool. And you're going to need IT support, and you might need HR support as well. Internal audit might need to be there. So you need to think about who else within the company across functions should also be at the table taking a look at the demo.
Yeah, and I think Lara and Foster, I'm sure you can speak to this, but what are your thoughts on having like an initial demo to filter out between the 3 to 5, and then having a second to bring in more of those stakeholders? Do you think would that be best practices in your thoughts, or do you think you do one demo? What works best in your experience? Lara, first to you, then to Foster.
So a lot of the work we do is actually that initial sense check, because frustrated legal teams or business teams shopping for these tools have reached the end of their wits trying to wade through all of this. So I think that a smaller group doing that initial first step conversation, like I said, you should be able to communicate to potential vendors, these are my priorities. I want an initial call to find out these things. And if they do pass your initial test, you'll be able to weed out some. Then I would probably schedule a longer, more detailed demo that's focused still, a tailored demo, not a rogue, this is everything we do demo, for a broader group of stakeholders, because you don't want to waste people's time. Again, that buy-in is so delicate. You don't want to drive people crazy right from the get-go when you're now starting the big time suck demo after demo. So I feel like having a frontline team, internally, externally, to help you do that initial sense check of probably a bigger pool of vendors, to shortlist them and then create structured demos for your shortlisted finalists, I guess, for a slightly larger group. is a great idea. And then I would take it down to 1 or 2 proof of concept pilot, whichever way you're going, and then you grow that group as you go. But definitely a gatekeeper group at the front to spare everybody a little bit of misery is really helpful. Like I said, legal teams don't want to hear 10 hours of demos in there. Like, they just never want to hear those words. Not ever.
That makes complete sense. Foster, what about, and quickly before we move on, what about, you've communicated your requirements to the vendor, you've been super clear. What if a vendor doesn't listen to you or provides that kind of full scale basic demo for you such that you don't feel like they've answered your requirements? What do you think that says, or how do you recommend pushing back on vendors if they're not actually kind of listening at the beginning?
I usually cut them off, and I just say, hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we want to stay focused on our requirements. So if you could move on to the next responsive component of your presentation, that would be appreciated. It's slightly rude, but at the same time, I think it's also slightly rude on their part to not be focused on being responsive to our requirements. But what I typically like to do, depending on the significance of the tech that I'm buying, is start with an RFP, get responses, select 5 for demo, and then usually cut that down to 2 to 3. And whether that's a follow-on demo or like a proof of concept, but just having it so that you're laser focused. Because in this day and age, if you want to see a demo, most vendors have some sort of video out there, right? You don't need to take up their time and yours and others to get familiar with their technology. So just be mindful of that. You don't necessarily need to have like a formal demo meeting to get familiar with someone's tech solution. Really wait until the stakes are higher, you're further along in the process to really start committing people's time to evaluating.
That's a great point. I've spent a lot of time on YouTube looking at vendors. It goes a long way. Lara, I think I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I was agreeing with Foster, absolutely. And also, like I said, my red flag is that I said earlier is yeses to everything. I like to go in transparently and tell me what you do well, what you don't do. I accept some things are on your roadmap. Anybody who's saying they can do everything, integrate with everything, and if anybody tells me they can implement a heavy system in 6 weeks, I'm like, next. It's rare depending on the size of the system. But again, smaller ones, quick plugins that don't need configuration, different game. But there are a couple of salesy flags that go up, but not everybody can do everything well. So the ones who are transparent generally lead my pack.
Yeah, a demo is basically an interview, right? So if a vendor answers the "what don't you do well" question with "we're a little bit too dedicated to our clients," we're a bit too available for support questions, they're maybe not your vendor. And also it helps to know, like Foster, to your point about cutting people off, to make sure they're focused on the requirements. If they still don't listen to you after you've, really pushed them to say, I don't want to listen, I don't want to focus on this because that's not a need of ours, that might also indicate for you that they may not be the right vendor for you. Like, you are talking to their sales team, but even after you talk to other people or you send follow-up questions, if they're not answering you or committed to your requirements, they may not be the right vendor. Okay, so we talked about avoiding demo fatigue. Before we move to questions, can we talk about decision time for the right vendor? You've narrowed down to the 2 to 3, you've gotten, stakeholders involved to help make the decisions. What do you look for in a vendor, and what are some red flags to watch out for if they may not be the right one for you? Lara.
I think I jumped the gun on this one. I think I just said it, like,
okay.
Transparency and honesty in relation to the requirements that I've given them. We all accept certain amount of limitations. And sure. I would also, especially, again, I say it often because it is something that trips people up, if there are configurations or implementations, who's doing those implementations as well, the vendor team, outsource teams, it does make a difference. And configurations out of the box or custom make a big difference, not just to time and effort, but also to the cost that's going to be attributed to the entire project. So add those onto my list of other red flags of just tell me the truth, please. That's pretty much it for me.
No, I think that makes sense. Foster, can you talk a little bit, when you think about red flags, Lara mentioned costs, hidden costs to be aware of that a vendor may not necessarily be fully transparent about upfront, but you should kind of be aware of for your team?
The licensing model is really critical to understand because ultimately you want to scale your solution throughout your business so that you can maximize its potential. So understanding what that model looks like and how it's going to accommodate you scaling that solution is really important, because if it's per user per seat, then your adoption is going to have a cost to it. And making sure that you understand that is really critical, because if you have a solution, but only a fraction of the people in your company can use it, then it's not as meaningful.
That makes sense. And Lara's mentioned POCs and considering doing those with vendors. Kyle, in your experience or based on your recommendations, do you think it's best practice to do a POC? Do you think some people can move forward without one? I mean, what do you think helps make that decision for you as to whether to test the product before you buy it?
Well, one thing is going to be, is there going to be an additional cost for doing the POC? So you just have to think about your budgetary constraints, or how the vendor will include the cost of the POC in the ultimate price that you wind up paying. Otherwise, I think it just depends on the situation and how big of a lift it's going to be. A POC could be really good because then you could, if you're not completely committed to the product contractually, then you can actually see, is this going to work for my team? And if it doesn't, then you can cut the cord without too much additional cost.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be a really big factor in the ultimate decision making. So I'm going to move us to questions. I'm sorry I only left this 5 minutes, but audience, please put your questions in the chat. Let us know what you'd like to talk about. We're happy to spend the last few minutes answering any questions that come to your mind about existing tech, deciding on new tech, evaluating new tech, things along those lines.
Let me just add too, going back to the demos, like we kind of had negative sentiment on demos. We were talking about fatigue and they can be miserable and stuff, but I find that they can be fun as well. And hopefully the vendors, like part of the vendor's presentation is going to be based off of the energy that you bring to it, right? They're going to be more energetic if you're energetic. So I would say, they're taking their time to try to show you what's best about their products. So hopefully you come into it with, at least at the start, a positive attitude and looking forward to seeing what they can do. And that typically leads to a better demo.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll give people just a little bit to type if they've got any questions. Otherwise, we'll just kind of close out with some thoughts here. So actually, I'll take just a second to go back to the slide that I missed here. When you're actually, you've selected your vendor, that's really only the beginning. We just talked for an hour about making a decision on legal tech, and it really is only the beginning, because implementation itself is such a journey. Lara, how do you set expectations for your team and for the business team about the length of implementation, the amount of time that it takes, both kind of project-wise and individually to support it, things like that? How do you make sure that everybody understands what's being asked of them internally?
That's why I think we're all saying kind of the same thing, especially around the requirements gathering in that current state. We kind of get a sense of how much we have to do before we can implement something successfully. If everything is in good shape, your people, your process, your data is all looking pretty good and in a structured environment, you're probably okay for a relatively short and effective implementation. It's rarely the case, though, especially when you're trying to bring teams together. So in my experience, whatever time period the vendor says is usually incorrect. Now they're talking about literally switching it on technically out of the box. You have to factor in how much do I have to prepare internally before I even get to them? Because all they're going to do is sit in implementation meetings and say, give me this, give me that, give me this. If that's not ready, you shouldn't have started that process just yet. So once you're prepared, even once you are prepared, and there are other things that need to be considered, I would just say budget for longer than you think. Don't rush it for the sake of rushing it. I think that there are things you can light up in phases as well. The phased approach is something to be valued and leaned into, because you can start getting buy-in on things that work well, as opposed to trying to light it all up on at the same time and then losing credibility. So yeah, my 2 cents on that.
That makes sense. And you talked earlier, Lara, about, it's better to err on the side of more communication than less. So both preparing for implementation, then communicating updates to the business and to the team. Just be honest about what's taking so long, how it's going, what they need to think about, things like that. Kyle, between decision making and actually starting implementation, what are your recommendations for understanding from the vendor what things they are going to ask from you so that you can prepare internally so implementation goes more smoothly?
Hopefully that conversation is happening in the lead up to actually signing, so that you're prepared once you sign the agreement with the vendor to hit the ground running and get that information that they need. Sometimes your IT department will require some sort of security audit from the vendor on the front end. You don't want to have a contract signed and not have that security audit already done, because that could potentially be an issue for your company. So just again, it's the common theme here: communication and figuring out what everybody needs on the vendor side, in the legal department side, as well as the broader company side, to have a successful implementation of this new tool that you just bought.
That's great. I agree with you completely. One last question I'm going to direct to Foster, and then I'll close us out on the presentation side and give it back to Avi. I ask a question here about what are your options if your team doesn't have kind of the internal resources to support the implementation. I asked you earlier about hidden costs. What are some things to keep in mind for, when or if you might need some third-party support to make an implementation go more smoothly?
Just to plan for those resources and ensure that that budget has been accounted for. Because if you have only your CLM, only your tech solution budgeted for, and the vendor resources are expecting you to kind of have a component in that, and you haven't discussed it on the front end, then it's going to be a challenge after the fact, which isn't where you want to be. So that's something that, as part of your process of talking with vendors, is important to understand. So that way, in getting not only commitment from the business to spend the money, that they also get a commitment to resource it, whether it's by providing internal resources or supporting you in getting a third party engaged.
No, that's wonderful. I agree. I will close this out here. Just as a note, like Avi said at the beginning, we will send this out if it's helpful to anyone. You can click these links. They'll go directly to each of our LinkedIn pages if you want to connect with any of us. We're all nerdy in this legal ops, legal tech space, and happy to talk about it anytime. So thank you so much for your time, panelists and audience. It was awesome to get to talk to you about this today. Avi, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, so much. It seems like the panelists did such a good job that no one has any questions. So everyone is leaving with all of their questions already answered. So that's just as evidence of how good of a job you all did. So thank you. Quick reminder, the recording will be available shortly in your library if you are a member. And also this webinar is eligible for one professionalism hour in Ontario and one CPD hour in BC. And reporting instructions, as well as the slide deck, will be sent to all of you shortly. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining, taking the time out of your day to learn about this important topic. And have an amazing rest of your day, everyone. Thank you all.